Today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau spoke with U.S. President Donald Trump. Among other issues, they discussed the U.S. extradition request for Huawei's CFO Meng Wanzhou. According to the Prime Minister's office, quote, the Prime Minister thanked the President for the strong statements of support by the United States in response to the arbitrary detention of 2 Canadians in China. The 2 leaders agreed to continue to seek their release. The phone call comes as a Canadian delegation in China is walking a fine line this week there to promote stronger ties between the 2 countries while raising the issue, of course, of the 2 Canadians in custody now for nearly a month. Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were detained after Canada arrested Huawei's CFO on a request from American authorities. So what was the response from Chinese officials? Are we any closer to resolving this diplomatic standoff? Conservative MP and Vice Chair of the Canada-China Legislative Association, Michael Cooper, is in Shanghai, and he joins us via Skype from there. Hi, Mr. Cooper. Thanks for your time. Thanks for getting up so early for us. Appreciate it.
Hi, Vashi.
I want to start off by asking you, who did you raise Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor's cases with, and what kind of answers have you received?
We had a few meetings. I guess the key meetings were with the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, which is a large academic institution that has a lot of links with universities and other academic institutions and science research, including in Canada, as well as with the Vice Deputy General of the Shanghai People's Congress. And I guess if you were to put that in Canadian terms, that would be more or less like the Deputy Mayor of the city of Shanghai. So we conveyed the Canadian message about our serious concern about the detention of Mr. Spavor and Mr. Kovrig, the fact that it is an arbitrary detention, and we emphasized the fact that it's not business as usual and can't be business as usual so long as these 2 Canadians are detained. So that message was conveyed loud and clear by our delegation.
Was it received? What was the response?
Well, the response was, I guess, to some degree more of the same in terms of a reiteration of the position that the Chinese government has taken, including the Chinese embassy in Canada. But nonetheless, the message was heard, and I believe it was important to get that message across.
Did you raise the issue? Did you and your colleagues raise the issue, or was it the people you were with on the Chinese side raising the issue of Meng Wanzhou being detained here in Canada, or the extradition request?
They did raise the issue with respect to Ms. Meng, and in that regard, we emphasized the fact that her arrest is pursuant to Canada's international obligations, pursuant to an extradition treaty that we have with the United States, and that an ultimate determination of what happens to her, whether she is extradited to the United States or not, is based upon the law. It will be based upon the facts that are presented to a court totally independent of politics, who will consider those facts and apply the law to those facts. And we emphasized that that is the independent nature of our judiciary, the independent nature of law enforcement, the fact that this is not a decision that was made by the executive or by the legislative branch, and that it would be entirely inappropriate for either to intervene, that is seized by our courts at this time.
In all honesty, do you think there's any chance they believe that?
Look, I think that they've got to take it at face value. Perhaps there's some misunderstandings or some differences of understanding in terms of what our court system is, what are the independence of our judiciary in China. That same independence doesn't necessarily exist with respect to their judiciary. So we tried to convey that message as best we could, and I think it did get across.
Are there any meetings planned with other figures, I guess. I take your point that you raised it with, somebody like the deputy mayor or the Academy of Social Sciences, but are there any more high-level meetings in which you can raise these issues?
We will be raising this issue. I guess I can't speak on behalf of all the delegation, but I can say if yesterday was any indication, all of my colleagues who run the delegation are as committed as I am to raising this issue. And yes, I do intend to raise this issue because, quite frankly, when we talk about the important bilateral relationship between Canada and China, in terms of trade, investment, strong people-to-people links, and so on, it's very difficult to talk about how we can move forward when there is this elephant in the room, namely the fact that we have two Canadians who have been arbitrarily detained without, for all intents and purposes, access to consular services, without access to legal representation, who are in detention conditions that are completely unacceptable. Those points were also raised.
Former ambassador to China, Canadian Ambassador David Mulroney, told CBC that this trip should have been postponed, that your trip should have been postponed, because it sends the wrong message, that the message is that by going there, you're saying the relationship between Canada and China is unchanged. I want to read exactly what he said. To suggest somehow this is about parliamentary process and the rule of law at a time when China is so manifestly ignoring the rule of law is also not just confusing but harmful. What's your response to that?
Well, I read Mr. Mulroney's comments as well, and I believe, and I can't speak for Mr. Mulroney, but as I read his comments, it was in the larger context that somehow this issue of the detention of the two Canadians, Mr. Spaver, Mr. Kovrig, was not going to be raised, and in fact, it was raised. We conveyed that it is not business as usual. And further to that, in terms of this delegation, it was planned before their detention. And we consulted with Global Affairs Canada, with our embassy officials, with our consul general here in Shanghai. And the message was consistent, that it was better to proceed and that it was helpful that we're here. So that's the basis upon which I'm participating.
Do you feel that there will be any kind of tangible improvement or tangible movement, I guess, on the issue because of your visit? Realistically, after your conversations so far, do you feel that will occur?
I think it's important to emphasize that we were not initially here because of this issue. This is not why we initially came, although now that that has happened, of course, it is the overriding issue. And further to that, the officials that we are meeting with are not directly involved. They do not have a direct say on the fate of either of the two Canadians. But I believe that getting the message across, conveying that message wherever possible is constructive, and that's what we did, and I think that's what others are doing, and so in that regard, I believe it is helpful.
Quickly before I let you go, another former ambassador, Guy Saint-Jacques, on this program said that his advice would be for the Foreign Affairs Minister to head over to conduct these types of conversations on a different level. Based on your experience, do you think that would be effective?
Well, I think that's a possibility. Obviously, the government's going to have to consider a range of options. But what I can say is that as a member of this delegation, I'm trying to do whatever small part I can play, and I know the other members of our delegation feel the same way, to do what we can to convey the issue and to reiterate the message of the government of Canada to the Chinese officials that we meet with.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Cooper. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Vashi.
It's time for the Power Panel. In Toronto, Brad Levine of Council Public Affairs. Yolande James, former Quebec Liberal Cabinet Minister, is in Montreal. And here with me in studio, former Director of Policy to Stephen Harper, Rachel Curran, now with Harper and Associates, and the CBC's own Katie Simpson. Hi, everyone. Great to see you.
Hello.
Katie, I'll start with you because you've been following this story really closely. And there's sort of two interesting points of view here. The one that Mr. Cooper is espousing, which is we're emphasizing that it's not business as usual. And then one that we heard from former Canadian Ambassador to China, David Mulroney, saying, yes, but your trip there kind of makes it seem like it's business as usual.
And one point of, it's important to note that the trip that was planned, it was planned well in advance of this, of what's gone on the past month, but also it's a multi-party trip. There's Michael Cooper is a Conservative on the trip, and then there are one Liberal senator or a senator who identifies as Liberal, and then 3 Liberal MPs, because there's no such thing as a technical Liberal senator, so you just have to, I'm going to get emails about, no, there's no such thing as a Liberal senator. But that's not the point I'm trying to make right now. No, it's important to note that they did receive some of that criticism, and this is where, the question goes back to global affairs. Okay, so if this group, the group of 1 Conservative and 4 Liberals, they get together and they consult with global affairs, and global affairs decides, you know what, it's better to go than not go, and that's the message that we've heard from Michael Cooper, that's the message we heard from Senator Day, and of course Senator Day, who's leading the delegation. He was the one speaking with global affairs. If that's the position of global affairs, they think that it's, what we've heard is that they think it's better to have more lines of communication. But on this trip, these Canadian politicians are not meeting with anyone who's going to have any sort of influence over what's going on.
So far, just not to interrupt, but Mr. Cooper said today that they met with what amounts to the Deputy Mayor of Shanghai as well as the Academy of Social Sciences. They have other meetings coming up, but that's who they spoke with already.
Yeah, and when I did some interviews with Senator Day last week, he essentially said they're meeting with provincial officials, not necessarily anyone who's going to have that sort of ability to, walk into any high level of power in some office in Beijing and say, okay, you know what, we need to change what's going on here. And not that China is necessarily going to listen to a group of Canadian diplomats. But a question that we had in the newsroom when we learned that this delegation was still going ahead was, is it somewhat tone deaf to still go and try to foster that relationship at a time when Canadian citizens are being sort of plucked from the streets, or at least with those two, we saw Michael Spavor, Michael Kovrig, Canada's called their arrest arbitrary. So we put that question to experts, because that's not my question to answer. But the experts that we did speak with, a professor as well as former diplomat, said, you know what, any line of communication that you can get open helps in the process. But again, former Ambassador David Mulroney certainly seems to take a different approach. So there's a whole wide range of views on this issue.
And I mean, at least based on what Mr. Cooper said, Rachel, they do seem, very much taken with the idea that they have to deliver that message, whether it's going to have impact or not. I mean, the whole interview was him saying over and over again that they know they have to raise the issue and that it's, the rule of law, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it sounds like they're taking every opportunity they have to deliver that message loud and clear, and I don't think it's a mistake for them to go and do that. I would just hope that it's not displacing higher level efforts. So I guess the question is, and we're not hearing about this necessarily, and maybe that's because we can't hear about it at this stage, but what else is happening behind the scenes? What else are we doing to ensure that these Canadians are going to be released? So, of course, there's the 2 that we know about, but we also heard 13 others were detained, and some of them have been returned, but some of them have not. So this is really about as serious a situation as it gets. So we should absolutely be doing everything possible, up to and including having the Prime Minister pick up the phone and call the President of China to make sure that these Canadians are properly treated and that they are eventually, hopefully soon, released. So I guess the question is, we've got this effort going on by these parliamentarians. I don't think that's a bad thing for them to be there and to be raising these issues. But what else are we doing? Are we talking to our allies in a coordinated effort to put pressure on China? Who else are we talking to?
Sounds like it came up in the conversation with President Trump today.
Yes. Well, I mean, the U.S. should be a logical ally. Now that we have President Trump in charge, that's not really something we can necessarily rely on. But there are certainly other allies we can call and say, look, what are you doing? What can you do to help us pressure China on this issue? So I guess, what else are we doing would be my question. This is fine. It's not going to be enough. we really need to be applying pressure across the board and at a much higher level.
It's an interesting question about the idea, Yolande, of allies and how much pressure we're able to apply in concert. There's sort of been a debate on the show over the past few days. You know, there have been those statements that were issued, but is it enough? Should there be more pressure? We had a Democratic senator on the show the other day who said the U.S. could be doing more. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, it's also a question, I think, of determining, and Rachel alluded to that, is whether these discussions, pressure is done privately, and what information we're privy to and what we're not aware of. I don't think there's nothing that has been more clear. I think that the government, I should say, has been pretty clear about their intention of seeing this as a high priority, as to what action should be taken, as to what information is rendered public to all Canadians, and at what moment. I mean, we have to be sensitive to the diplomatic exchanges towards that. But just to go back to the meeting, I was reassured because there was some confusion floating around as to whether the issue of the Canadians being released was on the agenda or not. And I think for this mission to be okay, it's so imperative that the executive and the legislative branch be exactly on the same page, what it appears that they have. But I do agree with Rachel that I don't think that that's going to make the difference. I think the phone call that took place between the President, Trump, and the Prime Minister today, I think is surely part of that. But as to the details, as to what was discussed and how impactful that will be, it's hard to be able to make that assessment given that we don't have obviously, the information at this time.
Brad, what do you think? Do you think we should be looking for more public displays of pressure on China, or could there be enough happening behind the scenes?
Well, I think that Mr. Cooper's message about that it's not business as usual needs to have some teeth behind it. So can we point to things, can we point to enough things that are substantial that actually show that to be true? Because nothing would be weaker than meeting with the deputy mayor of Shanghai saying that things are different when in reality they're not. You know, a couple of cabinet ministers have canceled meetings. The Minister of Heritage canceled a celebratory event in December. Government of British Columbia officials have canceled trade missions. Is that enough to kind of put some teeth to it? I don't know, but to the effect that this parliamentary group was going to substantially move the needle, with all due respect to the group, that wasn't their mission, nor do I think that they were meeting with anybody that would have anything to do with it. To cancel that envoy would have sent a stronger signal, and it would have escalated. Clearly, global affairs and the federal government do not want to see that escalation going on at that level. But I think that Canadians want to see something soon that is more substantial than just saying that it's not business as usual. I think that we need to see some teeth behind those remarks.
What's so interesting, Katie, is that we heard from Mr. Cooper wouldn't really answer the question, but we've heard from every diplomat that's been on the show that used to work in China, that this idea, including former foreign affairs ministers like Peter MacKay, this idea that somehow China can be convinced that our system, we operate under the rule of law, and that this arrest was only, not political in any way is almost impossible. I mean, Michael Cooper was saying they have tried, they told them that over and over. But I said, honestly, do you think they believed you? And he kind of avoided answering, but everyone else has said no.
Well, and the other thing to remember is, last week when Global Affairs came out and confirmed, and Globe and Mail had it first, Global Affairs confirmed that 13 Canadians had been detained in China since December 1st. But when you take a look at the information, that's about average. What isn't usual, what is unusual are the arrests of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, because they are accused of such very serious, they haven't been charged with anything officially, but that's how China operates. That's not new. And the numbers, we've been speaking with officials, those numbers actually came out before the holiday break, that at any given time there are 200 Canadians roughly that are detained in China at any given time, and that those numbers had been steady for quite some time. So that's just par for the course. It's very average. And Canada trying to get that message through to China that, the executive branch is not involved in these judicial decisions because they don't operate like that. It doesn't necessarily resonate over there.